Using and selling children is one of the most despicable things that a person could ever do. To take someone completely innocent and use them for whatever they wish is a certain evil possessed by only the very worst members of our society. Unfortunately, there have been many instances of children being sold and used that were entirely legal. From the institution of slavery, to government-sanctioned groups taking children off the streets and parading them around the nation, to a woman who sold over 1,000 children and made over $1 million doing it, people have profited off the mistreatment of children for hundreds of years. So please, join me today as we discuss the horrible history of legalized child enslavement and trafficking in the United States. As depressing as it is to think about, human trafficking isn't a new concept, and it is mostly, if not entirely, stemming from slavery. Slavery has existed in every civilization in many different forms as far back as history can tell us. The Mesopotamians kept slaves, Egypt kept slaves, and even the Israelites kept slaves, with God decreeing many laws about it in the Bible. Apparently the Golden Rule applies even to those who haven't heard it. Of course, it's not all the exact same kind of slavery, and there are actually 6 types of slavery that I will run through now. The first one is human trafficking, which is forcibly removing someone from where they currently live and using them for things like labor under the threat of violence, such as when, during trade with Africa, white settlers bought people from there and brought them across the Atlantic Ocean for labor. The second type of slavery is forced labor, where someone is forced to work under threat of violence. This is the standard antebellum South slavery that you are taught about in school. Debt bondage is when someone is forced to borrow money and then work it off. This was a common practice in the postbellum South when large plantation owners would utilize sharecropping to legally enslave people. Descent slavery is when the status of slave is passed down from one person in a family to the next, something employed by the antebellum South. This allowed many people to forcibly impregnate their female slaves and make more slaves in the most disgusting way possible. Child trafficking, the one most important to this video, is when children are married off, sold, used for labor, or a combination of those things. Outside of the antebellum South forcing enslaved children to work, the owners of large factories during the Gilded Age of America would often employ children for lower wages than adults. The final type of slavery is marriage slavery, when someone is forced to marry another person under the threat of violence. It should be kept in mind that children have been enslaved as far back as there is evidence of slavery. The earliest known reference to slavery comes from the Hammurabi Code from 1754 BCE, with a plethora of laws dictating how slaves are to be treated and punishments they shall receive. However, it is important to understand that slavery was not based on race as much as it was based on economic status or being a prisoner of war. It was only after Africans became the primary source of unpaid labor that race became the deciding factor in whether or not someone would be enslaved. Anyways, it is these mentions of slavery that tell us that slavery had existed in Mesopotamia for much longer, possibly even since its creation. Egypt also kept slaves, with its economy relying heavily on the use of forced labor. If you know the Old Testament, and specifically the book of Exodus, you'll know that for a long time the children of Jacob/Israel, he changed his name after wrestling with God for a whole night, were kept as slaves until Moses liberated them. I'm not sure how much their experience has taught them though, because in the book of Leviticus, which takes place in the month immediately following the construction of the tabernacle, and still in Moses' lifetime, many laws concerning the treatment of slaves are laid out by God. Greece and Rome also based much of their economy on slavery, with about 1/3 of both their populations being enslaved peoples. Different from other civilizations up to this point, slaves could obtain some level of freedom either by purchasing it or by being given it by their masters. Despite this, they weren't ever able to become full citizens and still had some amount of bondage to their former masters, often required to perform some sort of work for them. Luckily, around this time, slavery began to be questioned from an ethical standpoint, such as with the figure Bishop Gregory of Nyssa. In Rome, slaves were often used for sport in the gladiator ring, and revolts were common, despite the extremely harsh punishments for disobedient slaves. Interestingly, slaves were able to work in the more skilled trades rather than only manual labor, and were even allowed to eventually become full citizens. Following the fall of Rome, and during the medieval period, little is known of what happened to Rome's large slave population and to what extent slavery existed. Without Rome's presence allowing for large-scale markets, things like the slave trade were unregulated, and few records were made. However, it is known that slavery did exist, primarily in the form of chattel slavery, meaning that slaves were treated as property and not people. This system was later used in America and its own slave trade. Eventually, though, the island of Great Britain did rebuild and became its own flourishing economy. Because America eventually became a major hub for slavery, it is important to go into a bit of history regarding England's relationship with slavery. In 793, the Vikings invaded England, and about 70 years later, in 865, a larger force intended to take the rest of the region. However, in 1066, William the Conqueror conquered England, and, after taking a census, found out that approximately 10% of the population was enslaved, meaning that at least some of those enslaved people were Anglo-Saxons owned by Anglo-Saxons. Then, about 40 years later, in 1102, slavery was abolished in England, replacing it with serfdom, which is essentially generational sharecropping. Serfdom became the primary institution in England for about 500 years in some form or another, until serfdom's final form, villeinage, I think that's how you pronounce that, was abolished in the 17th century. For those curious, it was pretty much the same thing. The primary cause of its decline was the Black Death of the 1400s, as, with the declining population, serfs were able to barter for higher wages and freedom. In the 1600s, England got into the African slave trade, with the trade becoming truly massive in the 1660s due to the incorporation of the Royal African Company, and a total of around 3.1 million slaves would be transported by English ships. Tragically, around 400,000 of them would die during the passage, something recounted by Olaudah Equiano in his book, The Interesting Narrative Life of Olaudah Equiano. Obviously, this institution quickly spread to the English colonies and became a major piece of the economy, especially in the agriculturally oriented South. The Articles of Confederation, which is basically the pre-Constitution Constitution, dictated that slavery could not exist in the North, and that is about the only important thing that it did. Interestingly, the Constitution never directly mentions slavery, however it does provide indirect protection of it in the 3/5 Clause, which stated that enslaved people were to be counted as 3/5 of a person for representational purposes in the House of Representatives. The Constitution also stated that America wouldn't be allowed to participate in the transatlantic slave trade after 20 years, which was the first day of 1808. Of course, nothing was said of the domestic slave trade, which included selling children, an unfortunately common occurrence, and it continued unimpeded across the South until the institution of the 13th Amendment, which banned involuntary servitude except as punishment. Following this amendment being passed, wrongful imprisonment, along with the aforementioned system of sharecropping, were often used to legally enslave African Americans. After America moved away from its primarily agricultural economy and became industrialized, people began to work in large factories, which obviously utilized underpaid labor as well as child labor, often entrapping people to work as long as possible for as little as possible. Robber barons such as Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Charles Vanderbilt would become some of the wealthiest men in the country, if not the world, through business practices such as these. These practices only came to an end when Theodore Roosevelt took up the mantle of the president after the sitting president McKinley was assassinated by anarchist Leon Czizgalz, who believed that McKinley was, quote, an enemy of the people. Roosevelt became known as a trust buster and would dismantle trusts, which were conglomerations of companies with the intention of working together to collectively make more money that he deemed harmful to the customer. I also have to mention that he created the FDA after the publication of Upton Sinclair's masterpiece, The Jungle, which explored both the terrible working conditions thousands were subjected to, as well as how disgusting the meatpacking industry was. Shortly after Roosevelt's term ended, World War I happened. There isn't anything important to this video to talk about, it's just an important mention. Following the Roaring Twenties, a time of massive economic growth in America, the country was plunged into the biggest economic disaster that the world has ever seen, and it forced many people to resort to some of the most painful things imaginable to survive, including selling their own children. Although the Great Depression didn't create the problem of selling children by any means, it certainly exacerbated the issue and allowed many to profit from it. To understand why the events we are about to discuss took place, we must first understand the history of adoption and how it was viewed in the United States up to about the Great Depression. In colonial America and the early years of the nation, adoption was a largely informal practice. Extended families and communities often took in orphaned or abandoned children without legal proceedings. Kinship care was common, and grandparents, aunts, uncles, or neighbors would raise children when their biological parents died or could no longer care for them. However, these arrangements were rooted in survival and mutual support rather than in legal or psychological ideas of permanent family bonds, which resulted in the children often being exploited for labor. At the time, the concept of the childhood was different from the way it is today. Children were often seen as economic contributors to the household and were expected to begin working or apprenticing at a young age. Rather than focusing on a child's emotional needs, care arrangements emphasized labor, obedience, and discipline. There were also indenture systems in place. Orphaned or poor children were often quote-unquote bound out through indentured servitude. Children would be taken and taught by tradespeople in exchange for labor, though this system was very exploitative. By the early 19th century, growing urbanization and immigration, particularly in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, led to increased numbers of impoverished and homeless children. In response, religious and philanthropic groups began to establish orphan asylums and children's homes. These institutions were intended to provide shelter, food, and moral instruction to orphaned, abandoned, or destitute children. However, they were not places children would typically be adopted. Instead, they functioned more like boarding institutions, with the ultimate goal of placing children into apprenticeships or employment once they were old enough. Adoption still remained largely informal, and the legal system offered no clear mechanism for transferring parental rights. Courts occasionally arranged guardianships, especially for inheritance purposes, but these were not the same as modern adoptions. One of the most important developments in the history of U.S. adoption began in 1854 with the orphan trade movement led by Charles Loring Brace, the founder of the Children's Aid Society in New York. We will get more into depth later, however a quick description of it is that after being faced with thousands of homeless children living on the streets of New York City, Brace sought to place them with farming families in the Midwest, whom he believed would provide healthier, more moral environments. Between 1854 and 1929, it is estimated that over 200,000 children were relocated from eastern cities to rural communities across the country. These orphan trains were both a response to urban poverty and an early attempt at child placement on a mass scale. However, most of these placements were not legal adoptions. Children were often taken in on a trial basis or as laborers. Many found loving homes, but many others were mistreated or used as unpaid help. Few were formally adopted under any legal process, and there was little follow-up or oversight by the placing organizations. The first modern adoption law in the United States was passed in Massachusetts in 1851. This landmark legislation, known as the Adoption of Children Act, very creative name, recognized adoption as a legal contract and emphasized the best interests of the child, a revolutionary idea at the time. The Massachusetts law required court approval for adoptions and sought to ensure that adoptive homes were quote-unquote fit and proper. Other states slowly followed suit over the next several decades through adoption laws that varied widely. Some states allowed only for adoptions by relatives, others required the consent of the biological parents, which could be difficult or impossible to obtain, especially in cases of abandonment. By the late 19th century, reformers such as Jane Addams and organizations like the National Child Labor Committee began to advocate more strongly for children's rights and protections. As part of the broader progressive-era reforms, these efforts helped spur interest in regulating child welfare and family law more systematically. The rise of juvenile courts around 1900 also contributed to the formalization of adoption. These new courts were tasked with protecting minors and had the authority to terminate parental rights and approve adoptions. However, the idea of matching a child to a home based on emotional and developmental needs was still in its infancy. In this period, adoption was strongly influenced by ideas of race, class, and morality. Middle and upper-class white families were considered ideal adoptive homes, while children from poorer, immigrant, or minority backgrounds were often stigmatized. Agencies tried to match children with families of similar ethnic and religious backgrounds, and interracial adoptions were rare and discouraged. Adoption was also often shrouded in secrecy. Unlike today, adoptive parents frequently concealed the fact of adoption, and records were often sealed. Biological mothers, particularly unwed women, were frequently shamed into relinquishing their children, and their identities were hidden to protect the social status of adoptive families. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 had profound effects on family and child welfare systems. Economic hardship increased the number of families unable to care for their children, leading to a rise in foster care placements and institutionalization. Adoption agencies, many of them private and religious, were overwhelmed by the demand. At the same time, fewer families could afford to take in children. Some children were left at orphanages or hospitals, sometimes with notes pleading for help or promises to return. The Depression also intensified discussions about public responsibility for child welfare. While adoption remained largely a private affair, the economic crisis highlighted the limits of charity-based systems and laid the foundation for the eventual development of public welfare programs, including those that would address child protection and adoption in the decades to come. One of the most famous, or infamous, cases of selling children comes from Indiana and the 4 children for sale image. The image shows a large sign reading, quote, 4 children for sale, inquire within, end quote, while the 4 children sit cluelessly beneath it, and the pregnant mother stands beside them in tears. Despite speculation that the image was staged, what the children suffered was very much true. The ad was run in Valparaiso, Indiana's local newspaper, the Vidette Messenger, on August 5th of 1948. The woman pictured is Lucille Chalafou, and her husband, who isn't present in the photo, was the out-of-work coal truck driver Ray Chalafou, while the children in the image are Lana, age 6, Ryan, age 5, Milton, age 4, and Sue Ellen, age 2. Because Ray didn't have a job, the family was facing eviction from their apartment and, out of desperation, sold their children. Tragically, these children were sold to different families, so they were not only split up from their parents, but from each other. The child Lucille was pregnant with at the time, David, was also later adopted out. Lucille remarried and had 4 other children after the photo was taken, however didn't seem to have any love for the children she sold when they later went to see her. From the statements they have given, her children have very different opinions of her. David justifies her actions in an almost Darwin-esque way as necessary for survival, while Rayanne has stated that she believes her mother should burn in hell. As far as I am concerned, I do understand where both sides are coming from in their beliefs. It's going to become apparent throughout this video, however abusing adopted/purchased children was a common practice, and tragically still is, and the Chalafou children were no exception. Rayanne and Milton were purchased by John Ruth Zoteman. I think that's how you pronounce that. Rayanne alleged that she was sold for $2, which is $22 today, which her mother used to play bingo with. The Zotemans were terrible people and treated the Chalafou children they purchased like slaves. The day after being purchased, Milton was beaten by John, who explained that Milton, whose name was changed to Kenneth David Zoteman, that he was going to serve as a slave on the family's farm. Rayanne's name was also changed to Beverly Zoteman. Both children recounted that they were chained up almost perpetually and did little other than work in the fields. It's a well-known fact that abuse suffered in childhood often results in the one abused later becoming an abuser as adult, something very visible in the Zotemans' lineage. The Zotemans' biological son later told about how his mother had been SA'd as a teenager, something that also happened to Rayanne. Furthermore, in his teenage years, Milton was often violent and eventually deemed a menace to society and placed in a mental institution, all clearly due to the abuse he suffered at the hands of the Zotemans. Fortunately, it doesn't seem as though the other children were placed in such terrible conditions. The aforementioned child, David, stated he grew up in a loving, if strict, household, and Sue Ellen said she grew up in nearby East Chicago. As adults, the children tried to reconnect. However, Lana, the oldest of the 4 children, had died of cancer in 1998. Because she wasn't able to tell of her childhood experience, it is unknown how she grew up. However, Lana's siblings have gotten into contact with her adoptive parents. Luckily, Milton, Rayanne, and Sue Ellen were able to meet each other. By the time they reunited, Sue Ellen had developed lung disease in its late stages and wasn't able to speak much, communicating instead through written statements. The story of the 4 children for sale image is a truly terrible one, and it shows the true lengths our society forces people to go to in order to survive. From the years of 1854 to 1929, an attempt was made to rescue all the orphaned children of the nation and find them loving homes, and it's estimated that around 250,000 children were moved from the streets of major eastern cities out west. Unfortunately, many of the children weren't orphans, and others still were horribly mistreated by the people on the train and their adoptive parents. By the 1850s, America, especially the areas of New England to the Midwest, had become extremely industrialized, and many cities, such as New York and Boston, were built around large-scale production plants. Unfortunately, the workers were paid very little, and people were forced to live in tenement houses, which were cheap apartments without any utilities, and people crammed into them like sardines. Uncleanliness was a part of living there, and any sickness would spread throughout the tenement houses like wildfire. Jacob Riis published the massively influential book exposing these apartments, entitled How the Other Half Lives, in 1890. Outside of terrible living conditions, the factories that people in the cities worked at were often extremely hazardous, and workplace accidents and deaths were commonplace. One major example was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. These 2 factors led to a lot of children being left without parents, and in New York City alone, there were between 10 and 30,000 orphaned children. These orphans were referred to as street Arabs, and would do anything they could to make money. Many were forced into selling things like rags, newspapers, and matches just to make a little bit, and they often joined gangs for protection from violence on the street. Many children, some at just the age of 5, were arrested for being a part of these gangs. It should be noted that there were some institutions for orphaned children to go to, however they were given very little funding, food was scarce, and children were expected to leave them at about 14 and begin fending for themselves. As such, orphaned children weren't cared for by anyone, and were instead pushed to the wayside by the uncaring system that existed in Gilded Age America. That all changed when Charles Loring Brace moved to New York for seminary training. Brace was a minister and a Yale graduate who, after being surprised by the number of orphaned homeless children on the streets of New York, founded the Children's Aid Society. The Society's mission was removing as many children as possible from the poor conditions of the city and helping them become functional members of society. Originally, this was done by establishing the nation's first home for wayward children, the Newsboys Lodging House. It worked similar to an orphanage in the way that it provided children a home, however it also gave children an education and religious teachings, all for a small fee. Eventually, though, the house ran out of room, and Brace, inspired by the European practice of placing out parentless children, came up with the idea of sending children to farming families to be raised. This idea began more locally, with children being individually sent out in states neighboring New York. However, that too needed to become more large-scale, and children began being moved in large groups. The children were transported by train, hence the name of orphan trains. However, the name didn't become the prominent way to describe them until they had ended. These trains of adoption would predate modern adoption practices, and were a much more primitive system than the system of foster care that we have now. The thing is, not all homeless children were accepted to ride the train. The Children's Aid Society only took the children they believed would be given homes, which, in the mid-1800s to early 1900s of America, meant healthy, white, young children, and those with disabilities, weren't of European descent, or were on the older side, were often passed by. Many weren't even orphans, and their parents simply were unable to properly take care of them. Interestingly, many weren't even sent out west, and nearly 1/3 of the children that were adopted out still lived in New York, while neighboring states such as Connecticut and Pennsylvania received a substantial number of children as well. It wasn't uncommon for children to get moved if one home didn't work out, and some children that had been moved far out west would be sent back into New York City to live with a different family. All transportations were treated the same by the Aid Society, and placement decisions were based on availability rather than what would be best for the children, and, as is to be expected, background checks weren't exactly necessary to adopt a child. The children were treated closer to cattle than people during the whole experience. Hazel Latimer, a rider of the train, recounted her story of being taken despite her mother still being alive, saying, quote, "I'd just finished eating, and this matron came by and tapped us along the head. 'You're going to Texas. You're going to Texas.' Well, some of the kids, clapped and laughed. When she came to me, I looked up and said, 'I can't go, I'm not an orphan. My mother's still living. She's in a hospital right here in New York. You're going to Texas. No use arguing.'" End quote. To be quite honest, though, she was a bit luckier, as she had at least some understanding of where she was going. Many children weren't told what was happening, why they were being taken from their families, or where they were going. The train cars were very poor quality as well, especially in the beginning. Luckily, their quality did increase as time went on, and the Aid Society was able to get more money, and by the end, children were riding around in sleeping cars. All of this does lend credence to the idea that Brace really did have the children's best interest at his heart. While on the train platforms, the children were treated more as animals or items up for auction. Prospective parents would often inspect them to see how fit they were for field work or chores around the house. The true tragedy comes, however, from what the adoptive parents did to the children that they took. However, before that, it would be wrong of me to undersell the orphan trains, as it did have many successes to come out of it. Many children were able to find loving families and homes, and many children who rode the orphan trains as children grew up to become very important people. The National Orphan Train Complex Museum and Research Center estimates that as many as 80% of the children found good homes. Governors of North Dakota and Alaska, Andrew Burke and John Brady, even rode the train as orphans. This model for getting orphans homes actually became very popular across the nation, and many orphanages partnered with the Children's Aid Society in an attempt to find homes for more children, something extremely important for a time when orphans were seen as genetically inferior and lesser than because of their financial and social statuses. Anyway, now that we've had our little bit of happiness for this video, back to more depressing things happening to good people. After a placement was made, an agent of the Aid Society stayed in town for a while to make sure the home truly was a good fit for the child. If this was found to not be the case, the child would be rehomed and the process would repeat until a quote-unquote good home was found for the children. After the child was homed, there were 2 checkups made in the first year and another annual checkup until the child was formally adopted or aged out. For females, this was at 18 years old, and for males, this was at 21. Unfortunately, because the Aid Society didn't have the money or resources to do that for the thousands of children they rehomed, many children simply weren't checked up on, allowing for the abuse they suffered to continue unimpeded. Outside of the clinical and almost inhumane treatment of the children, they would also often experience troubles with their families if they found one. Newborn children and older boys were the ones most commonly picked, as they were the best suited for labor, so those that got rejected were forced into a sort of limbo, where they constantly rode the rails looking for someone to take them in. Many never even found a home. Adoptions were quite impromptu, often being held at places like churches, hotels, courthouses, and schools. Furthermore, due to the nature of the adoptions, proper background checks weren't often made on parents despite the laws having been established at that point. In fact, many laws concerning adoptions were created in 1851, only a few years before the orphan train movement started. In 1883, an independent investigation was conducted, and it was found that the screening process for these parents was quite ineffective. Children that were adopted out were commonly referred to as quote-unquote train kids and ostracized or bullied from coming from such a lowly place. However, the tragedies these children suffered extend far beyond that. As I mentioned, many of these children were abused or simply exploited for labor. One such case is that of Alice Bernard, the last known survivor of the orphan trains. Bernard was born on March 16th of 1916 and, at the age of 3, was adopted by a French couple that had immigrated to the U.S. through Ellis Island. Bernard was placed onto one of the orphan trains with 50 other children and became one of about 1,200 who were sent to Louisiana. A tag on her dress read August Jeffrey Erath, L.A., those being the name of the person who had basically ordered her from a Catholic priest and the town that they lived in. When Alice arrived in Louisiana, she spoke English and had to learn French to communicate with both her adoptive parents and other people in the community. Amazingly, she learned the language quite quickly, however was forbidden from speaking it when she reached first grade. Despite this, she retained all her knowledge of the French language throughout her life, even learning to read and write in it. In school, Bernard was ostracized for being an orphan and would often avoid bringing it up in conversation. However, what happened to her at home was much worse. One of Bernard's sons stated that Auguste Jeffrey had lost both of his wives and 3-year-old daughter to yellow fever and remarried before immigrating to America. He also stated that Auguste was generally kind to his adoptive daughter. However, his wife treated Alice as a servant, forcing her into doing most, if not all, of the chores. She wasn't even legally adopted by the couple until she was 14 years old in 1930. Despite her terrible childhood, she led an extremely honorable life after graduating. She married in 1942 and raised 7 children with her husband, living on a property in Louisiana left to her by her adoptive parents. The couple became important members in both the church and community, participating in their children's school activities, as well as many local groups and clubs. Near the end of her life, she became a quote-unquote living exhibit at the Louisiana Orphan Train Museum, and the dress she stepped off the orphan train in is on display in the museum to this day. Unfortunately, at the age of 98 years old, Alice Bernard passed away. Another, much less encouraging story to come from the orphan train was that of Charlie Miller. He was born on November 20th of 1874 in Manhattan, near where the very first orphan trains were run. He was born to German and Irish immigrants and 2 older siblings. Shortly after his birth, his parents had another child. Charlie's mother died when he was young, forcing his father to keep the family together while still earning a living. This began his father's alcohol abuse and eventual suicide when Charlie was 6 years old. With no family, the Children's Aid Society took them in. Miller was first placed with a farming family in Virginia. However, his stay there lasted less than 6 months because of the amount of labor expected of him. Being from the city, he had no experience with it, not to mention the fact that he was only 12. Miller was placed into a couple other farming homes, each time expected to work for his room and board. However, none of them worked out due to him always running away and his constant bedwetting issue. The Aid Society had done many things to try and stop this issue of his. However, all any of them did was hurt him more psychologically. Eventually, after making his way through the Midwest on his own, he went to Rochester, where, with the help of his sister, he found work, however decided to go west to become a cowboy at the age of 15. On his way west, he often stole from people for money, a practice that landed him a 6-week prison sentence. After getting out of prison, he was brutally attacked by another group of runaways. This beating saw a resurgence in his bedwetting problem and caused him to buy a .32 caliber gun from a pawn shop. Without much money, he got most of his meals by begging and eating scraps from the trash. In Omaha, he heard about the need for some cowboys in Wyoming, so he hopped on a train headed there. In his car were 2 other young men from Missouri, Waldo Emerson and Ross Fishbaugh. They had a decent amount of cash on them, as well as some fairly valuable assets, primarily a silver pocket watch. In Sidney, Nebraska, the pair left the car for a night of fun. By coincidence, when hopping into another boxcar, Miller was also in it. That night, the drunk and hungry Miller killed the 2 men and took their belongings, which included $45, the aforementioned pocket watch, 2 silver dollars, a knife, and a .38 caliber pistol. He left his own gun behind. After changing his appearance, he made his way to Kansas, where his brother Fred lived. Eventually, he admitted to Fred that he had committed the murders, and, with the help of Fred's adoptive father, went to Manhattan, Kansas to turn himself in. The trial lasted only 3 days, and on April 23rd of 1892, the 18-year-old Charlie Miller was hanged for his crimes. The orphan trains shut down in 1929, almost 80 years since their creation. By that time, many laws had been passed prohibiting adoptions across state lines. Furthermore, as city conditions became safer, the number of orphans diminished. The cities also began to care for their orphaned populations themselves, rather than relying on the help from others. As such, the orphan trains were no longer necessary. This, along with the expiration of several agreements between the Children's Aid Society and other charities allowing for large bonds as security placements for the children, ended the practice altogether. In the end, the orphan trains were a well-meaning, if poorly maintained system. Charles Loring Brace seemed to truly care about the children that went into the Children's Aid Society and hoped they would find better futures. It was the abuse and exploitation perpetrated by the adoptive parents that is the truly evil thing in this case. However, that shouldn't completely overshadow all the good things that came from it too. Many of those children really needed to be removed from the situations they had been put in, and many that were put into another bad situation were able to rise above it in amazing ways. I'm not unaccustomed to human depravity and disgusting, deplorable things, but people like Georgia Tann have a special kind of evil that makes me sicker than any gore or violence ever could. She is truly one of the most evil people to ever live. Georgia Tann was the woman who popularized adoption, getting recognition from people such as the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. However, she also kidnapped and sold over 5,000 children, and many of the parents that she adopted out to did unspeakable things to the children they adopted. Georgia Tann was born into a society that heavily stigmatized adoption. The ideas of eugenics and class division permeated society, and the majority of the upper classes believed the impoverished to be genetically inferior. This made adoptions uncommon, with orphaned children most often being sent to workhouses, where they worked in exchange for room and board, and some of the most terrible conditions for anyone, especially children, to have to experience. Tann was born on July 18th of 1891 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, to Beulah and George Tann as the oldest of 2 children. She was born into the upper class of society, with her mother being a schoolteacher and her father being a judge. Her parents wanted her to become a concert pianist, however she never liked the piano lessons she was forced to partake in, instead acting tomboyish and expressing an interest in pursuing law, often following her father to work and watching him handle various cases. Her parents, however, didn't want her to pursue such a career, as they believed that such a job was one that women should not have. Tann began her eventual career as a social worker at the age of 15 when, after seeing a pair of orphaned children in a case her father was working, she convinced a local wealthy couple to adopt them. It appears as though it was here that she made the connection between adoption and profit, something that would majorly influence the rest of her career. Growing up in the time she did with the social status she did, she was obviously exposed to some amount of animosity for the poor, especially disadvantaged women who had children they were unable to take care of. However, her hatred for these women was cemented when her family, while investigating reports of an abandoned child, found a child wrapped in dirty rags alone in a cabin. Its mother was a drug addict who had been arrested and only considered her child after coming off her high. Helping those children was not a one-time occurrence for Tann, though, and she spent much of her teens volunteering and doing charity work, which some speculate was a way to avoid socializing with people her age. Despite passing the state bar exam to become a lawyer, she decided against becoming one, and instead decided to major in music, as her parents had always wanted her to. It's uncertain exactly why she decided against becoming a lawyer. However, it's possible it was because her father, who was often described as a domineering person, forbade her from doing so. After graduating, Tann taught music at a school in Columbus, Mississippi, while doing some work. It appears as though she was dissatisfied with this work, however, because she eventually quit and began working full-time as the receiving director in the Mississippi Children's Home Society. It was here that her deplorable actions began, and so many families were ripped apart. It's so sad to think that so many terrible things could have been prevented if Georgia had simply decided to stick with something before she came into social work. She started working at the MCHS as receiving director, meaning that she processed the children that came into the home's care, as well as finding homes for the children. It was while working here that she reconnected with a childhood friend who would become her lifelong partner, that being Ann Atwood. Tan was 8 years older than Atwood, who had a baby born out of wedlock, and the pair quickly began living together. Atwood had appended Hollinsworth to the end of her name to make it appear as though she had been widowed, rather than face the shame of having a baby born out of wedlock. Though it was never confirmed by either, it is commonly believed that the pair were lovers and never told anyone due to homosexuality being considered socially unacceptable and often criminal at the time. It was also during this time that Tan realized just how many people were so desperate to have children that they would pay for them. The first documented case of her stealing a child was in 1922 when she abducted Onyx Harvey, the 2-year-old son of a single mother, Rose Harvey. The family lived in Jasper, Mississippi. However, Rose struggled to keep the pair financially stable due to her diabetes and pregnancy. Tan saw Onyx playing on the porch and lured him into her car with some candy, then drove away, the whole ordeal taking less than 5 minutes. She took Onyx to her father immediately afterward and convinced her father that Rose was an unfit mother, something that was not by any means difficult because of her father's opinion of poor people. Onyx was quickly sold to another family, and Rose never got him back, something made especially sad by the fact that she was able to get together enough money to hire an attorney. That said, this event did have its consequences. Everything that happened had given Tan a poor reputation around town as a kidnapper, so, with Atwood and her son in tow, she left Mississippi for a brief stint of time in Texas. It was in Texas of the same year that she adopted a young girl called June. She had intended to parent June, however began to suffer from post-adoption depression and left Atwood to do much of the parenting. June's daughter would later describe Tan as a, quote, cold fish, end quote, which is my new favorite way to describe someone like her. Of course, this icy attitude toward children wasn't limited to her adoptive daughter, as she treated the children in her quote-unquote care with the same demeanor. Following her time in Texas, Tan moved into the town she would spend the rest of her life in, and the town where she would commit the rest of her atrocities, Memphis, Tennessee. Upon arriving in Memphis, she was hired as executive secretary to the Tennessee Children's Home Society branch based in Shelby. When talking about Georgia Tan, it is important to keep in mind that she was hired to this place in 1924, a time where you could completely leave behind your previous life, and there would be little trail to connect you back to it. If she didn't want the people in Tennessee to know why she had left Mississippi, they weren't going to know without doing a lot of research. I don't believe the crimes she could have committed could ever be committed today, especially not to the scale that they were committed. Tan quickly rose through the ranks of the society, coming to control it within the year that she began working at it. That same year, Tan began her practice of trafficking children to whoever would buy them. Tan employed many tactics to obtain children, both legal and illegal. Obviously, children did come into the society out of sheer need to be housed, however it was her illegal practices that made the number of children in her care skyrocket. As we saw, Tan had no qualms about simply grabbing children off the streets of lower-income neighborhoods, however she would also steal them from their mothers shortly after giving birth. Tan had a vast number of people in her pocket, and she would often have nurses get new mothers high on anesthesia to sign paperwork that gave up their children to the society, then tell the mother that the children had died, something not uncommon even today, due to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. Another thing she would do is take children born of inmates by getting Judge Camille Kelly, a woman we will talk about soon, to declare them wards of the state. It is important to mention Tan's tactics for getting children adopted, as they had a major impact on the way adoptions were perceived throughout the country ever since. As I mentioned, both poor people and the children they had were perceived as genetically inferior and less than the elite of the society. Tan convinced people otherwise. She said that it was actually nurture rather than nature that was the most important part of how a child turned out, and that the children up for adoption were blank slates ready to be molded into functioning members of society. That is to say nothing of her other means of getting people to adopt, like changing birth records, but we'll go into that later. We'll get into this later in the video as well, but it can't be understated how important Tan was to the social perception of adoption. That doesn't justify her other actions by any means, but it is still important. Tan would also charge exorbitant amounts for children. Adoptions within the state of Tennessee were only able to cost $7, however, adoptions that took place across state lines were quite a different story. Figures vary, however about 80% of the children Tan sold went to California and New York. Every 3 weeks, 2 of Tan's employees, Alma Walton and Regina Wagoner, would fly to these states, respectively each carrying between 4 and 6 babies. From there, they would meet with wealthy couples hoping to adopt, and, after getting them to adopt, charge them for things such as the baby's flight and room, as well as background checks on the parents that were never performed. The average cost to adopt from Tan was around $5,000, something close to $84,000 today. Of course, little of this money was ever given to the society, and Tan would always have the checks made out to her. She even sold to some very famous people, such as Joan Crawford and Dick Powell, and even sold the child who would eventually become professional wrestler Ric Flair. She was even credited by Eleanor Roosevelt as an expert in child welfare and invited to FDR's inauguration. Obviously, these terrible practices made Tan a very large amount of money. Because it wasn't legal, exact figures are unknown, however it is believed that she made around $1 million, or $11 million in today's money. However, it also gave her something that was just as useful to her, and that was blackmail. Tan now had some of the most intimate connections with the most powerful people in America, something she would later use when she needed it. Despite the seemingly immense amount of power Tan seemed to have, she relied heavily on the people in power in Memphis for a lot of her work, one of whom being the infamous Edward "Boss" Crump. During the Gilded Age and in the decades that followed, political machines were very widespread across the country, the most famous being Tammany Hall, run by Boss Tweed. Of course, Memphis also had its own political machine, which held its power for almost 40 years. Headed by the aforementioned Crump, he maintained political control over the city from 1915 to 1954, either serving as mayor or appointing other people to the position. Shortly after beginning her practice of kidnapping children, Tan gained legal protection from Crump, who would turn a blind eye to her illegal activities in exchange for bribes. She met another one of her major allies, Judge Camille Kelly, for similar reasons. Kelly was one of only 2 female judges in the South, and the only one sitting as juvenile court judge. It is unknown when the two met, however the two quickly formed a business relationship. Whenever Tan came across a law that served as a detriment to her practices, she would send it to Kelly, who gave the list on a piece of paper to Abe Waldauer, Tan's final important friend who we'll talk about in a minute. By writing the changes on her own paper and in her own handwriting, it was assumed that these changes had been made by Kelly, not Tan, who had no affiliation with the law or the power to change it. Interestingly, many of the laws she got changed are still in place, such as the fact that in 32 states, birth certificates of children being adopted remain confidential. Of course, changing laws was not all Kelly did for Tan. We mentioned how Tan obtained children, and how kidnapping them off the street was quite common for her. Kelly would often do this too, with some sources saying that Kelly provided Tan with as many as 20% of the children that eventually came into her care. Then, whenever it was time to determine where a child would be placed, Kelly, the juvenile court judge, would always side with the society. She didn't do this for free though, and Kelly would split the money gotten from interstate adoptions with Tan. This brings us to our final major character in the Georgia Tan timeline, that being Abe Waldauer. Tan first met Waldauer in 1933 when she needed help with her disabled brother's, quote, claim against the government, end quote. Following this, Waldauer remained both Tan's and the Tennessee Children's Home Society's attorney. In the economy, there is an ever-important idea of supply and demand. The higher demand is, the higher you can charge, however only when supply allows it. This is what makes rare items more expensive than common items. Tan applied a similar idea to her children, and eventually her supply far exceeded her demand. To combat this, Tan, in a collaboration with a newspaper in need of a quote-unquote feel-good story, put out an ad. This ad displayed a smiling young boy holding a ball and explained how he, along with 24 other children, would be raffled off before Christmas. For $25 apiece, prospective parents were able to purchase as many tickets as they wanted. This ad became extremely popular in the community and also ran in the following years, each time to rousing success. She would also start handing out catalogs of the children staying at the society, allowing parents to choose the qualities of the children they adopted. This gets into another common practice of Tan's, which is falsifying records. With her clientele being the wealthy, she wanted to do everything she could to please them, including changing the parents and histories of the children they were purchasing. She would often tell clients that the child was the result of a one-night stand between two socialites who hadn't intended to have children. This extended even further, though, as she would often change aspects of the child's history, such as religious background. This served multiple purposes to Tan's operation. For one thing, she made the adoptive parents feel as though they were getting a better quote-unquote product. However, it also completely erased any paper trail for real parents to follow, thanks to the law that she got put in place that kept adoption records sealed. About now is the time when we should talk about the conditions of the society itself, because it is important to understand how truly terrible Tan was. As I mentioned, she saw her children as a stock, and the people who birthed them as beneath her, often calling them quote-unquote cows or breeders. This belief was reflected in the abusive and neglectful way she treated the children at the society. Children deemed too ugly to be adopted out would be left in the sun or starved, and punishments such as meager rations, beatings, and being hung in dark closets were common. Tragically, SA was also common, both at the hands of Tan and other employees at the society. Even worse, this abuse often happened even after the children were adopted out as well, as with the lack of background checks, disgusting people were often able to get their hands on the children. Medicine was also an issue, as Tan refused to give any of the children proper medical care, causing many completely unnecessary deaths. During the outbreak of a stomach illness at the society, Tan refused to temporarily shut it down and move the children, instead opting to do only the bare minimum amount of sanitation because the former would have cost too much money. Furthermore, much of her staff was untrained and many were drug addicts, and children that stayed at the society were often sedated in order to make them more manageable. Only 19 children ever officially died at the society, however it is estimated that over 500 children actually died during their stay there. During Tan's stay in Memphis, the city had the highest infant mortality rate in the nation. Despite Tan's seemingly perfect public image, there were still whispers of the society not being a great place. As part of Judge Kelly's regular searches for children, she would often visit the local convent, which housed orphaned children Tan hadn't been able to get a hold of. Every time this happened, the sisters would always, quote, hide the prettiest ones, end quote. Furthermore, in 1941, the Tennessee Children's Home Society was dropped by the Child Welfare League of America due to it repeatedly not investigating adoptive children's backgrounds. When Gordon Browning was elected governor of Tennessee in 1949, things began to fall apart for Tan. Browning's election had happened against Crump's wishes, and Browning's promise to rid Tennessee from corruption signaled the end of Tan's practice of selling children. On September 11th of 1950, Browning opened an investigation into the society after receiving reports that the place had been selling children at a profit. Only 4 days later, Georgia Tan died. By the mid-1940s, Tan had been diagnosed with uterine cancer, however continued her operation without letting it bother her. So by the time the investigation into her actions began, she was completely bedridden and died before she could face any consequences for her actions. It is important to note that in the months leading up to her death, she had adopted Atwood in order for her to receive Tan's belongings, a common practice among homosexual couples at the time to allow their partner to inherit their property. The same year she died, the society was shut down. The thing about the investigation was the adoptions hadn't necessarily been illegal, and all parents who had tried to get their children back had been deemed unfit to raise their children, so they wouldn't be able to get tan on anything like that. However, they could get her for illegally receiving money. J. O. McMahon, the Public Welfare Commissioner, claimed that Tan had received up to $1 million in profit, and 3 months after her death, her estate was sued for $500,000. The case was settled out of court, and the Tennessee Children's Home Society received around $55,000, or 2/3 of Tan's estate, worth about $80,000 at the time. Atwood, who was never employed at the society and did little for it, died in 1995, having spent the rest of her life as a secretary for the Boy Scouts, partial owner of a children's store, and an artist. Despite the fact that she was a wife to a truly terrible person, it seems as though she was a good one, being a rather great mother to her children and grandchildren. As I mentioned earlier, Tan made many advances in the stigma around adoption and was a major part of shaping the way adoption is today. I say that because it is something important to mention when talking about Tan's life and legacy, however it does nothing to justify her abhorrent actions. We shouldn't have needed such a monster to fix adoption, and it's a tragedy that it was she who did. Eventually, the bodies of 19 of the children who died at the society were found and buried in an unmarked grave. In 2015, a monument honoring them was erected, bringing an end to one of the greatest tragedies in American history. In the end, despite anything good that Tan did, her life amounts to little more than being one of America's most prolific kidnappers, having destroyed the families of around 5,000 children and subjecting them to abuse that no one of that age should ever have to suffer. And with that, we are done discussing the history of legalized child trafficking in America. Sorry this one came out around Halloween. I didn't plan ahead very well. And I should have done something a bit more spooky and less depressing, but the world's not all that bad, because people like you who decided to stay and watch the end of this video, and for that I thank you. It's very nice of you to have done that. If you enjoyed, please consider liking or subscribing, because it really does help out more than you know. But even if you don't, thank you so much again for watching. Y'all are the best. Next video up will be another cannibalism tier 2, sometime next month, depending on how school and whatever goes. But even if you don't stay around to see that, thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.